Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. You can ask questions at any time during this webinar by posting them into the chat box in your meeting panel. I'm going to be answering all the questions at the end of the presentation. My name is Ihab Sami. I am the VP of Product and Marketing at Plurilock, and we build solutions that protect your workplace against identity threats. On today's webinar, I'll be talking about the regulatory compliance as it pertains to cybersecurity and how compliance cannot be achieved by technology alone, but rather it can be achieved through a combination of tools, technologies, processes, and controls, as well as try to break down some regulations to determine the top controls that apply to cybersecurity products. So before I start, though, I just want to be sure that I set the right expectations for the webinar. This is by no means intended as a comprehensive guide on how to achieve compliance with one or more regulations. In order to achieve compliance, I would highly recommend that you consult specialized service providers that help you with regulatory compliance and can actually better assist you with all the details and the steps, as well as any requirements for compliance for any specific requirements regulations. Instead, what we'll be doing is we'll be talking more about what regulations are, what common controls and practices these regulations preach, as well as the tools that can take you part of the way there. So it's important to just reiterate here that achieving compliance for any regulation requires a bunch of things and not just technology tools. So no single technology solution can make you compliant with any regulation. And any company that claims they're compliant with any regulation will only take you part of the way towards that compliance. But rather, it is a mix of tools and processes and peoples and changes and a whole bunch of different things that will take you through compliance. And just because one product is compliant in one instance or in one company does not mean that it's compliant in another company, for example, because again, there are a bunch of other environmental factors that will contribute to compliance. We're also really going to be only focusing on cybersecurity tools for this webinar. So, so we won't be discussing things like physical access controls or documentation requirements, although a lot of the tools we will discuss can also help you within some of these areas as well. So it's not necessarily that these tools don't cover it, but it's not going to be the focus of today's discussion. So let's start looking at the stars of today's show. So there's definitely no shortage of regulations out there that you need to comply with, and depending on the type of business that your company's in, you may be subject, or you may be you may be required to comply with multiple regulations and not just one. The list that you see here are just a small snapshot of the many regulations that are out there, but I chose them just for their diversity and the applicability to some of the things that we're going to be talking about today. Perhaps one of the most global ones on this list is the ISO 27001 standard. The reason it's global and pervasive is that, for one thing, it spans multiple industries and is mainly commercial, but it also provides a lot more specific instructions on how to comply with the different controls than some of the other regulations do. And it's also globally applicable in nature. So in many ways, you can consider ISO 27001 as a standard. You can consider that as a guide to cybersecurity best practices. And even if not planning on being formally certified for this standard, it's actually always good practice and a good exercise for evaluating your organization against these controls. It'll give you an idea of where you fit within the best practices for cybersecurity. So so check it out. There are lots of self-service checklists available online, specifically for most regulations, but 27001 is one of the more popular ones, and you'll find a lot more around it from that respect. You may also want to consider ISO 27002, which is a newer update to this standard, which actually brings us to a point that as technologies develop and cyber threats develop and more incidents take place, and remember this last part, more incidents take place, more regulations are going to come out and new controls are going to be introduced to existing regulations to get them to catch up with these advances, or if you want to call them incidents. So so never let your guard down, and just because you're compliant with a regulation today doesn't mean you're going to continue on forever being compliant with that regulation. Looking at other standards on this page, Some of them are industry or region specific. So for example, PCI DSS standard, it was developed purely for organizations who deal with consumer financial transactions. And perhaps it's best known to apply specifically to those companies who process credit card transactions and keep customer credit card data. So if you're storing customer credit card data, you must comply by law. Actually, in most places, you must comply, and most likely your transaction vendor will require that you comply with PCI DSS, which is why many smaller companies rely on third-party service providers and don't store credit card information themselves, because it then compels them to get PCI compliance. And PCI DSS is actually, it's also very specific in the details in its control. And and it's generally clear enough to comply with, although like every one of these regulations in this page, it doesn't mention any specific product or service that can help you with the respective control. Another control that's actually quite industry specific is HIPAA. And related to HIPAA is HITRUST. Both of these apply mostly to healthcare industry and have to do with securing healthcare data and keeping the services running. It's more or less a US-based standard, but has applicability elsewhere, as well as it has different international versions of it. So, for example, the NHS Digital Toolkit is the equivalent of HIPAA, but for the UK's National Health Service. So it applies in different places, and you will find different regulations that apply to different geographies as well. Well, one of the bigger logos on here is NIST, which is a standard that mostly applies to US government entities, but it has controls that are similar to the ones that you do see here. And we'll talk a little bit more about NIST in a few minutes. Then, of course, there are the ones that were created in response to an incident or a trend that governments generally get worried about. These include, for example, the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, or GLBA. Which also includes Sarbanes-Oxley and the SOX compliance, or SOX, as well as FISMA. All of these were made to modernize the U.S. financial services law, which had not been updated since 1933, at the time that that GLBA came into effect in '99. One of the well-known incidents that prompted the discussion for Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act was when a bank based in California, Charter Pacific Bank, ended up selling customer credit card numbers to an adult website that then started billing customers directly for that website. Look it up; it's actually an interesting case. But it started the discussion on what data can be shared with who. At the same time, FISMA and SOX also came into effect as a result of specific events as well. So, so you can look these up for more information. But the point here is that Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act affects financial services and securities companies and the way that they do business. Then, of course, if you were paying attention to the industry news over the last couple of years, you would have undoubtedly heard about GDPR, or the European General Data Protection Regulation, which also came into effect as a result of a new abundance of online data about people and how little control consumers had over that data that they provided to online service providers or social media sites. GDPR focuses mainly on policies around consumer data and the right of the consumer over their own data, as well as sharing and retention of this data. So even though it isn't as detailed in terms of the how to achieve compliance, it's very clear on the expectations and the responsibilities that organizations have with respect to customer data. GDPR applies to companies who have customers in the European EU countries, and applies to all EU countries as well. There are versions of this in other non-EU countries, like, for example, there's IRAP from Australia, or PIPEDA Act in Canada, for example. They all deal with data privacy and consumer and customer rights as it pertains to owning and managing and what you can do with their data. So there, so depending on where you are, things will apply to you. Now, the interesting thing about all this is that if you are an international health insurance company, for example, that does business globally as well as in the US and with the US government, you might very well find that you're required to comply with HIPAA, with GDPR, with NIST, with PCI DSS and with IRAP, as well as just because it's sort of one of the best practice standard, ISO 27001, and any other countries that you may do business with as well. They may require similar requirements. So so this sounds tedious, but that's why you have larger organizations, for example, have dedicated compliance officers who have their hands in everything, and everything needs to be to sort of go through that filter to make sure that they remain compliant with a lot of the regulations that that apply to them. Now, this may actually sound a little bit overwhelming, and may very well be, but there is a bit of good news, at least from an internal perspective anyway. To show you this, let's take a look at some of these regulations in a little bit more detail. We'll start off with objectives. What I've done here is I've summarized part of the objectives of some of these regulations from the last slide. And just listed them here. So for example, with Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act says that you have to protect consumer data. Sarbanes-Oxley says you have to protect investor data and the reliability of systems. PCI DSS says you have to protect payment and credit card information. ISO 27001 says that you have to protect their own IP assets as well as customer data. NIST says that they have to protect government information. HIPAA covers electronic health records, and GDPR covers everything else, including the fact, for example, that you like to watch cat videos online, and and has a requirement that you as a consumer have the right to make Google forget that you like cat videos. So really, when you look at all these objectives, it is to protect information that's kept on your corporate infrastructure. And it guides, or in general, all of these things will guide companies on how to protect that information and what their responsibilities are. So how do they do that? Let's, in order to do that, let's get a little bit deeper as well and see where we are. Of course, the deeper we get, the more specific we're going to need to get, and won't be able to cover all the regulations as we would want to, especially in one webinar. And since there are people and companies who specialize in digging deep into every regulation, this is way too much and beyond the scope of this webinar. But let's look at an example. On this slide, you can see scorecards for NIST as well as high trust requirements. And essentially, it starts to shed some light on what these standards look for. So the scorecards are basically color-coded for a specific organization, not a product and not a solution or a technology, but for an organization or an entity that is being certified for this regulation or evaluated for this regulation. Each box or hexagon is color-coded, and it represents how well this fictitious company is doing in that regulation. And I reiterate, of course, fictitious. This is just an example of what a scorecard looks like, right? And doesn't really represent any entity or company that actually exists. So here, for example, a red shaded box or hexagon means that this company has a very high risk in this box. Orange means high risk, yellow means medium, and so on, until dark green indicates a very low risk for that specific control, meaning that this organization is in good shape for certification for this standard or specific control. So for NIST, if we start in the middle, you'll see 5 main control types based on the threats. And they start with identifying the threats, protecting against the threats, detecting them, responding to them, as well as recovering from any damage that was caused by these threats to return to basically a state of business as usual. For each of these high-level controls, or if I want to be more precise, these are called sections. There are specific controls within these sections that outline how to achieve compliance with each of these sections based on best practices within the industry. So for example, under the Protect Section Act, you have access control, awareness, and training data, as well as data security, as well as a few other controls, of course, that all sum up to score this company under that Protect section. At the same time, if you look if you look at the high trust side of things, you'll find that overall the controls are the same. So, for example, access controls exist as their own section rather than a control within a section. Risk management is also a separate section, whereas where it's under identity, for example, for the NIST standard. So the point of this being that the different standards will have a lot of overlaps in the way that they evaluate company readiness for regulations. The main differences are always going to be based on what the focus of that standard and what it's trying to regulate, as well as how much details they want to go into. Some standards may just say that you must take appropriate actions to ensure the correct user is logged in, for example, while others might tell you specifically how to do that, depending, of course, on the standard itself. So now that we know what sections and controls are, which essentially are interchanged in different regulations, let's have a look at the controls on a macro level for some of these some of the most common regulations that we talked today that we're talking about today. So starting from the left to the right on this chart, you will find that the sections and controls for each regulation get more detailed. So, for example, from Graham-Leach-Bliley Act saying that the organization should designate a responsible party, all the way to GDPR, which says each organization should have dedicated data privacy executives, as well as resources, and as well as how to do that. And the types of tools to use. For example, the new term that has come out recently, and let me try to pronounce this correctly, is pseudonymization of data, which is more or less sort of the result of GDPR as well as some other incidents that have happened in industry, but essentially means that data should be stored in such a way that makes it impossible to get any information out of it without putting together a bunch of tables and data sources, meaning that a mix of encryption, data structure obfuscation, as well as design to make sure that personally identifiable data should be separate from the information on that identity, so that even if the database is stolen, it's very difficult to get anything out of it and to put it together to specific people identity and to continue to protect people's identities. But you will notice that as we go towards the right of this table, the controls start getting very similar. They all start to mention access control, for example, and all require a response plan and a mitigation strategy to exist. The wording and the stakes are a little bit different, but for more or less they're all requiring the same thing. Now, if we were to look at where each of these regulations has more details by reading through these regulations, it gives us an idea of what controls each respective regulation is trying to focus on. So for example, it's obvious that Graham-Leach, Bliley, and SOX very much care about having an audit trail of what happens, which makes sense because they're both financial services related. A lot of transactions take place, and the industry always needs to know who, when, and why transactions took place. So they want an audit trail of these transactions. They want an audit trail of communications, an audit trail of data changes, and even development work that takes place on the corporate environment is required for that as well. PCI DSS, on the other hand, requires more protection for cardholder data against theft and misuse. While its more focused regulations, start to show a more holistic approach. So, for example, with some of them start focusing on incident management and data protection as well as an audit trail. Then, of course, we move into HIPAA and GDPR, which, because of their intense focus on data, have also added privacy controls to their standards. And as more regulations are introduced, or as these regulations are improved or updated over time, you will see more focus on privacy moving forward. So now that we know the focus of these controls, we can go back to what we're trying to achieve. But before we get there, I just had to summarize the common controls that we saw in the previous slides across all the regulations, which will help us focus help us focus our discussions later. Now, this is a list of key controls that are found in each of the regulations that we've talked about. Now, of course, granted, in some cases, they mean different things. So, for example, for audit and accountability, some regulations will care more about network infrastructure audit and accountability, while others, for example, will care more about customer communications. And even others such as ISO 27001, for example, just says that this applies to everything on your corporate network. So look at these controls as generic controls and try to apply them to your specific use case. For the most part, everyone agrees that there should be robust access controls in place. Some go into more details by providing, as well as stating how identification and authentication should be done. So for example, if you have to use multi-factor authentication as part of HIPAA, while other regulations will just tell you that you should provide privileged access management without going into the details of what that means in terms of technology. Governance is something that is common across all regulations. As an organization, you have to have a data security governance and protocol in place. Audit and accountability usually states that transactions, network security, logins, logouts, access to data, communications, transactions, and a lot more are tracked. And tools do exist that allow for auditing after the fact. This also applies to external auditing, both by regulators as well as internal actors. So part of SOX, for example, indicates how quickly an organization should be able to respond to communication audit requests by regulators such as the SEC, for example. Contingency planning as well is probably one of the more process-oriented controls found across regulations, and in summary just covers how a company should handle security breach incidents and the reporting requirements for them. So for example, GDPR has very strict rules on how quickly a company has to notify authorities in the case of a breach and how to deal with that breach. This section also covers business continuity in case of a disaster or any crippling incidents take place that may stop your company from being able to operate. Risk assessment, even though it is part of governance, is separate in most cases because it should ideally be an effort by both internal as well as external parties to test and ensure that your company is prepared for whatever comes its way. Other controls on the list focus on the acquisition or the development of solutions, whether it's in-house or through third parties, and how this affects responsibility. So, for example, if you host your data on Amazon Web Services and someone steals your data, who should be responsible for that? Is it Amazon or is it you? Now, I know there are a lot of agreements in place, and that AWS in particular has very strong controls and legal frameworks that pretty much protects it legally against your data being stolen. But there are a lot of smaller third-party service providers that don't do this. So this is something that needs to be to be considered as well. Integrity monitoring, which is essentially the ability to continually ensure that your system integrity is intact, that no one has compromised it discreetly without your knowledge, and that mechanisms are working and are in place to ensure that this is the case as required by most regulations. Privacy and data retention and storage are both big controls and will will actually continue to get bigger as we use more technology, both from a consumer as well as business applications. As well as threat detection and protection. These are another two sections that are common across regulations. Their objective, of course, is to basically create a baseline for what is acceptable practice to detect and prevent threats from taking place in the first place. And of course, as threats get more and more complicated, then so do these requirements will get more and more complicated as well. Of course, without looking at regulatory compliance, any credible information security company or organization should already have a lot of these controls in place. So compliance with specific regulations becomes a little bit more manageable when you think that, if you're a competent information security organization, you probably already have all this and a lot of these controls in place anyway. So let's shift gears a little bit to the tools that are available in the cybersecurity space and how these tools can help you with compliance. Now, of course, my favorite place to look at when talking or discussing cybersecurity tools is the Momentum Cyberscape diagram, which is the one that you see here. Which, even though it doesn't include a lot of very compelling companies, it does a good job of portraying the types of solutions out there. So it's always a good starting point to talk about solution types, as well as their applicability to specific topics that we're discussing. So in order to sort of illustrate my point, I'm going to add a layer to this to this cyberscape. Now, this layer is pretty much a simplified view of the different classes of cyber solutions and regulatory controls that they may help with. Now, it looks complicated simply because of all the different classes of products, but do remember that no one solution will help you achieve regulatory compliance. It's a mix of governance, policy, technology, change management, as well as people management. So this is really a general guide as to what there is out there. And how to, how that pertains to compliance controls that I've got listed here. Of course, this is also generalized. So some companies in some of these classes will have more than one class of product, for example, or may have built their solutions in a way that helps with more controls than I've put in the respective class here. So always be wary of generic charts like this and use them as a starting point. We'll talk about how to look at a specific companies in a bit, and how to talk about specific or evaluate specific solutions in a little bit. But in general, if we were to start from the top left of this cyberscape, you'll see that there are specific threat detection and protection platforms that protect anything from network infrastructure to industrial control systems, which also have a lot of integrity monitoring built in them as well. And in more regulated manufacturing environments, we'll also have audit and accountability capabilities. So for example, pharma and medical devices will typically have a lot more auditing and accountability built into a lot of their control systems, for example. You also have managed security service providers, who, of course, for organizations who don't want to deal with all this complexity, can provide a service that takes you much of the way towards compliance and best practices. There are specific risk and compliance solutions that assist you with the regulatory and high-level aspects of compliance, whether it's risk assessment, integrity monitoring, auditing and accountability, of course, as well as governance. Now, moving down a little bit further, identity and access management solutions. These typically comply with access controls and privileged access management controls, as well as governance, and even auditing, as there are always records of the respective activities within each of these different solutions. There are also solutions that are built specifically for operational and incident response objectives. These will generally have a lot of features around audit, accountability, contingency planning, as well as integrity monitoring. There are, of course, some classes of products such as IoT and cloud security, as well as fraud and transaction security. And these by nature need to meet their respective controls. So for example, risk assessment, integrity monitoring, and for IoT specifically, we'll have access controls as well as the previous two. While security consulting, of course, is more around governance assessment as well as contingency planning. So they sort of can help you with compliance as well as a lot of your cybersecurity preparedness in general. Now, on the top right half of this page, you have specific web endpoint and application security classes of products. All of these have access controls, threat detection and response, as well as integrity monitoring. But many of these products, as mentioned before, will also help you with other controls. Maybe not 100%, but will take you part of the way to help with these controls. And perhaps, of course, one of the newer classes are the data security products, which deal with numerous data regulations that you have out there today and are useful for retention policies as well as privacy. So I understand that this slide is too high level to really tell anyone how to go about seeing the regulations compliance coverage, but but it is a starting point. And what I will do now is I'm going to try to sort of narrow it down from another angle. This slide is actually starting from the top down. Let's start from the bottom up. So for example, which means that I have a product or a bunch of products or a solution or an environment, and I want to see how far these can get me with compliance and how do I go about doing that. It's actually quite simple to do that. So first, you pretty much have to identify the regulations or controls you want to evaluate. Then you choose the tools that you want to see and see if they fit within these controls. Then you look at the sections and controls that you want to cross-reference with. This essentially allows you to generate a map of how this technology fits. Then once you've identified the gaps, you start looking for other technologies that try to fill these gaps. And of course, it doesn't have to be technologies. Some of the gaps can only be filled through some process changes as well as people management, for example. The process itself is quite simple, but step 3 is tedious simply because it requires a lot of reading through regulations as well as interpreting these regulations to see how they fit within the context that you're trying to compare against. So let's look at an example. Plurilocks fit to NIST regulations. We wanted to see how much coverage the Plurilock Defend product gives us for NIST controls. So of course, just knowing that we're evaluating Plurilock against NIST means that we've already identified the controls and the tools and pretty much have covered steps 1 and 2 on this list that you see. So we have to move on specifically to step 3. So let's move on to there and see how we got there. Now, as with anything that requires a lot of data, we need a spreadsheet. So in this sheet, what we did was we put up all the sections of NIST along with all the controls of these sections and the descriptions in order to understand what the control defines and to evaluate how Plurilock fits within that control. We then enter the value for each of these controls to designate how Plurilock helps with that control, and essentially has 3 sort of core values or assessments, if you will. The first one is we designated it as core, and what that means was that Plurilock was built specifically for this scenario in mind. So it was built to meet this requirement, the requirement of this control. Then we had a score of high, which means that Plurilock, even though it wasn't specifically built for this scenario, however, the way that it works is pretty much 100% matched to what this control requires, and is therefore a perfect fit. So it's kind of it's just a way to differentiate between whether we built it directly for this control or not. As well now, and medium essentially means that Plurilock can cover some of the requirements of this control, but isn't enough to perfectly meet these requirements. So you would probably need another solution or process or something to 100% match this use case. Now, forgive me if the font on this is too small, but I don't expect anyone to actually be reading the details of the spreadsheet right now. The key thing to note is that NIST has over 500 controls, and so to evaluate any control for the technology requires that you will go through all the different all the different controls that have it. In this case, it's about, I think, 570 Excel lines to summarize this information. Which we did, and as we did, the results ended up looking like this. The table on the right summarizes all the controls by how many were scored as core, high, or medium fit with Plurilock. And if you sum up the grand total numbers on the on the right column of that table, you will come up with 98 total controls that Plurilock Defend will help you with. This, by the way, is out of 570 controls that NIST has. The rest are not applicable to Plurilock, since many will be governance-based or incident management-based, etc. So the result is that these are the controls that Plurilock can help you with. And if we were to show that in, if we were to show that in a chart format, you would essentially get a visual representation on the right of the screen that shows you the fit for Plurilock within the specific sections that apply to us. Of course, we're not showing any of the sections that we don't fit into, since they would all have zeros anyway and would not be a good fit. But this is sort of a good overview of how one product, for example, can help you go part of the way towards towards specific regulatory compliance. We've actually also done this with a few other regulations against the Plurilock Defend product to help you see where we fit within this picture, and have a data sheet on our website that actually summarizes this information. So feel free to download it if you need to. Just look under the resources section on our website to get more information on that. Also, as a general rule for your security toolbox in general, so regardless of what regulations you have, just for general good coverage and a good cybersecurity posture, these four classes of products will generally give you strong protection as well as a high level of coverage for compliance controls. Again, having these four types of solutions does not make you compliant with any regulations. It's more about, it's a lot more about, it's a lot more than that, right? But these would just give you a head start. And to give you an idea of what that head start with, I've sort of did another overlay of here. And many of the controls that we've talked about are actually covered by having these. Of course, this assumes that you already have an identity and access management solution, because which everyone should have today, which covers the access controls as well as privileged access management controls for of most regulations, and can generally be configured to meet these controls. Again, I'm generalizing a little bit here, but each solution will have capabilities that are different from others. But in the end, what I'm trying to do is give you a starting point, as well as a way to tell if a solution or within your organization has coverage for regulatory compliance. And regardless of what that solution would be, if you want to generalize it even more, regardless of the class of type of solution that you want to implement, you basically want any solution to do the following that you see on the screen right now, which to improve your chances of achieving more regulatory compliance. That solution should always be continuous. It should always detect and work in seconds. It should be autonomous, meaning it requires minimal intervention by humans, and it should actually adapt by itself. Ideally should be invisible to end users, which doesn't exist in a lot of solutions, especially with identity management today. However, one of the things to look at with Plurilock Defend, for example, is that it is invisible to the end user. It should have logging and audit capabilities, so that, which would cover that part of the compliance requirements. It should work well with other technologies as well. So it should be open enough that, that other technologies integrate with it and allow it to do that. And it should be available on-premise or SaaS. That gives you a lot more flexibility in how you want to deploy it, how you want to test it, how you want to, to concept that. So essentially these are basic modern requirements that any cyber tool today should have. So to summarize, we looked at the most prevalent regulations today. We looked at what they have in common. We summarized these controls. We mapped them to solution classes that are out there in the cybersecurity world. We showed you how to evaluate against a specific regulation and gave you a toolbox of products that would take you, take you a long way towards best practices as well as compliance. But also reminded you that compliance is not just a bunch of tools. It's processes, change management, governance, and planning. So if you're looking for certifications, it's always best to consult with experts who do this for a living. Yep, and with this, I'm going to stop here and take any questions that you may have. So I see one question here about, it says here, you didn't really talk much about the privacy controls. Is there a specific reason for that? Good question, actually. I didn't talk about it a lot, simply because, GDPR is sort of the, privacy in general has a few main tenets, and one is to protect the data, which again fits within a lot more of the other controls, as well as the other reasons. We actually have a full webinar. If you look at on our website, we have a full webinar that talks about privacy and cybersecurity, and how that pertains to privacy and the regulations that apply to that. So it might be worth you having a quick look at that webinar as well, that covers privacy in a lot more details. And that's why we didn't look at that. And with this, it looks like we don't have any further questions. So with this, thank you very much for attending today's webinar. Feel free to reach out to me. My email is here, or check out our website for more information, or or for a schedule of any of the future webinar. Thanks for your time today.